Welcome to the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration HMEP Grant Program Grant Application Development Webinar for Program Year 2015. We're so pleased you decided to participate in the webinar. There's a lot of information we plan to share with you regarding the application process during the presentation. Also, we will address your questions and provide clarification if required during the question and answer session. If a question requires a more detailed response, we will incorporate that question and other relevant questions in our question and answer document and forward it under separate cover. Let's get started. Agenda. We want to provide a brief overview of our program, simply an introduction. We would like to get you familiar with the Hmap grant personnel, the people behind the scene, governing regulations, statute, and policies, grants under Hazardous Materials Grant Program, PHMSA grant schedule, grant application development, budget and budget narrative, common mistakes, questions and comments. Hmap Grant Program Office. Aaron Mitchell, Director. Lisa O'Donnell, Chief, Grants and Registration. Our new team lead, Matthew Jones, and he's the team lead for the Grants Division. Shakira Mack, Program Analyst. Angel Henriquez is our Administrative Assistant. And the following individuals are all grant specialists: Lisa Rottenbacher, Carla Shepard, Bonita Brown, Suzette Edwards, and Andre White. Regulations, statutes, and policies covered in this webinar include, but are not limited to, the following: 2 CFR Part 200, Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements. 49 CFR Part 110, Hazardous Materials, Public Sector Training and Planning Grants. Essentially deals with the grant application, eligible activities, cost sharing, etc. 49 USC Section 5116, Planning and Training Grants, Monitoring and Review. Hmap Grant Program Application Cycle Priorities. Internal priorities. We would like to effectively communicate the HMEP Grant Program directives and requirements to our grant applicants. We would like to provide applicants with the necessary tools to submit a successful grant application. And we would like to support applicants that require assistance by rendering what we call superior customer service. Essentially, we would desire to provide a timely response. External priorities. Encourage HMEP grant applicants to conduct thorough needs assessment. Essentially, know your needs and wants prior to completing the application. Allow sufficient time to communicate program requirements to the sub-grantee level. Facilitate increased sub-grantee involvement when assessing needs for the state, tribe, or territory. Essentially, bring them to the table. What's the best grant for your organization? The HMEP grant is divided into 2 funding areas: planning grants and training grants. Essentially, you should be able to decide if you need to apply for the planning grant only, the training grant only, or both. And as we stated before, a needs assessment definitely is one resource that would help you in making that decision. Planning grant. Essentially, it is to develop, improve, and carry out emergency plans and emergency planning and Community Right to Know Act of 1986, EPCA. It's important to remember that the 2 sections that our grant focuses on are as follows. Section 301, Establishment of State Commissions, Planning Districts, and Local Committees. Section 303, Comprehensive Emergency Response Plans. Some of the examples of HMP planning grant activities include the following. Develop, improve, and implement emergency plans. Perform exercises that test the emergency plan. Assess flow patterns of hazardous materials. Assess the need for regional hazardous materials emergency response teams. Assess current local response capabilities. And finally, conduct emergency response drills and exercises associated with emergency preparedness plans. Training grant. Simply explain, the training grant is used to train public sector employees to respond to accidents and incidents involving hazardous materials, to the extent that a grant is used to train emergency responders. Some of the examples of HMP training grant activities include the following. Design and develop preparedness and response training. Perform emergency response drills and exercises associated with training, a course of study. Test and evaluate emergency preparedness plans. Important dates to remember. Here's a few dates that you should remember when applying for the HMP grant. Applications open on February the 1st, 2015. Applications close on April the 3rd, 2015. You should also remember that you may require funding up to or at the full allocation. And as usual, applicants must apply through grants.gov. HMP grant schedule. As stated before, the application process opens on February the 1st. The deadline for the application is April the 3rd. The HMP grant is awarded September the 30th. And October the 1st, the HMP grant is open for use. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Andre White, to discuss the general components of the HMP grant application. Andre?
Thank you, Suzette. I'd like to talk to you guys about the development of the application process. First off, we're going to talk about some general components of the HMEP grant application. The first being the key contact list, the agency project manager, finance manager, and the administrative contact. These are all individuals who are key people in the grant application process. In the event that we need to contact someone concerning the grant application, we need to have these people readily available with contact information listed so that we may contact them to discuss the grant. The application for federal assistance, that's the SF-424. The budget information for non-construction programs, which is the SF-424A. Assurances and non-construction programs, that's the SF-424B. Other insurances include the anti-lobbying, debarment and suspension, drug-free workplace, Title VI, civil rights, EPCRA certifications. In addition to those certifications, we need a letter of agency designation, a statement of transportation fees if it's applicable, and last but not least, the National Incident Management System, or NIM statement. Now that we've talked about the general requirements, let's delve into the planning requirements. In the HMEP planning grant, we like to see our goals and objectives, the project activity description, which is proposed activities, milestones, cost projections, and outputs and outcomes of each activity. And last, we'd like to see the 75% pass-through to LEPCs. Our last component is our training grant component. The component consists of goals and objectives, project activity descriptions again, proposed activities, milestones, cost projections, and outputs and outcomes of each activity. 75% pass-through for the beneficiaries of public sector training, alignment with NFPA 472 and OSHA standard 29 CFR 19120Q. Here are a couple key components of the HMEP grant application that we should all be aware of. When creating your grant HMEP grant, remember these key components: your organizational information as discussed earlier, the project narrative, which consists of the project summary, problem statement, needs assessment, goals and objectives, project activities description, and your budget narrative. Your organization information is your agency's mission, how the subject of the proposal fits within or extends that mission, the structure of your organization, programs, leadership, and special expertise. The project narrative. A good project narrative helps you think ahead, so you'll be able to anticipate the resources and budget needed to complete a project. The project narrative usually includes a statement of the problem or purpose, the objectives of the project, background information about what's already known, and information on any foundation research that supports the project's feasibility. The project narrative has several components. These components are the project summary, the project statement, needs assessment, goals and objectives, project description, and last, the budget narrative. The project summary. The project summary is a proposal summary which appears at the beginning of the proposal and outlines a project. It can be a cover letter or it could be a separate page. It should be brief, no longer than 2 or 3 paragraphs. This makes it easier to include the key points necessary to communicate the objectives of the project. The summary document becomes the foundation of the proposal. The needs assessment. This is the driver for the application. The needs assessment is a key element of the proposal. It should be clear, concise, and a well-supported statement of the problem to be addressed using the grant funding. An applicant should include data collected that would illustrate the problems to be addressed. A needs assessment explained. What is a needs assessment? Well, we've covered this just a little bit briefly here, but I want to provide an example here. Needs assessment is a process to determine and address gaps between current conditions and current needs. If you see the equation below, we have a small illustration of desired program versus actual program, which equates to program need. You would look at your desired program as you would want it to be versus the current state of the program, which gives you a programmatic gap. These gaps will be included in your needs assessment, and these are the gaps that you're submitting within your application to the granting agency. Remember, it's important to differentiate between program needs and program wants. We recommend that all grantees or all applicants work closely with LAPCs, emergency response teams, and sub-applicants to establish an overall needs assessment for the state, tribe, and/or territory. It's highly recommended these process takes place before writing the grant application. Moving right along to goals and objectives. Goals are the overarching principles that guides the decision-making for the organization. Objectives are specific, measurable steps that can be taken to meet the goal. When including your goals and objectives in the grant application, ensure they are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. Project activities description. The project activities description outlines the tasks that will be accomplished with the available resources. It is helpful to include milestones within the project activities description. When included, it can be broken into smaller tasks, which can be laid out as a schedule over the time of the grant. Project description explained. When adding tasks and activities to the grant application, it is important to remember the who, what, why, where, when, and how many of proposal crafting. The who states who will be performing the activity. The what states what task or activity will be performed. The why states why is the task or activity being performed. The where states where will the activity take place. The when is when will the task take place. The how many states how many participants will be involved in the task or activity. And lastly, the how much states how much grant funding will be devoted to the task or activity. If you take note at the color code on the previous slide, you'll see an example here using that same color code to denote each portion of that model. Allow me to read the example for you. Tula County, a sub-applicant of the state of California, is proposing to conduct a Hmap refresher course as a number of responders are now due for training. Training will be conducted at Tula Hazardous Materials College in Tula County. Tula County is projecting to conduct a Hmap refresher course during the third quarter of the performance period for maximum participation. 57 participants are projected to attend this training. The projected cost for this training to include travel costs, supplies, facility rental, and registration costs totals to be $27,571. Going back to the color code, here is the model once again explained in further detail. The who, or who will be performing the task, is Tula County. The what, or the what task will be performed, is the Hmap refresher course. The why, or why is the task being performed, is members of Tula County are now due for training. The where, or where will the task take place, that will be Tula Hazardous Materials College. The when, or when is the task projected to be performed, that's during the third quarter of the performance period. The how many states how many participants will be projected to be involved in the activity, which is 57. How much is the projected cost, which is $27,571. I will now turn the presentation over to Matthew Jones, who will be talking about the budget and budget narrative.
Thank you very much, Andre. My name is Matthew Jones, and I will be going over the budget and budget narrative. I'm relatively new to PHMSA, but looking forward to working with you all in the near future. So the grant application budget and budget narrative, this is where a majority of our questions to applicants come through, and so we thought it'd be helpful to kind of go over the budget and budget narrative so that we can hopefully address some issues on before applications are sent in. So the grant application must include a budget that details the costs required during the performance of the project. So once you have decided on the major activities in your project that Andre had gone over previously, it is now time to develop a proposal budget. And the purpose of the line item budget and budget narrative can really be thought of in three main points. So first, it really provides a forecast of expenditures. It constructs a model of how your organization might perform financially if certain strategies and plans are carried out by the applicant. Second, it enables the actual financial operation of the organization in the grant to be measured against the forecast. And third, it establishes the cost constraints for a grant project. So the budget, an applicant's budget request is going to be reviewed for compliance with the governing cost principles, as well as some other requirements and policies applicable to the type of recipient and the type of award. And please note, we are now operating under new federal grant regulations. As I'm sure you're aware, the Super Circular, also called the Omni Circular, at 2 CFR 200. And so throughout the presentation, you will see references to the new requirements sprinkled throughout. So the cost principles, they really address 4 tests that we at PHMSA are going to look at in determining the allowability of costs. So in your grant application, any cost charged to the award must be allowable, allocable, necessary, reasonable, and consistently applied. Now, allowable means that it is allowable with the cost principles as well as the funding announcement or any other statutory requirements. Allocable means that the costs have to be chargeable or assignable in relation to the benefit received. Necessary and reasonable simply means are the costs necessary and reasonable to carry out the project. And consistently applied means costs should be applied consistently, whether they are grant funds with this project or throughout the organization. So the budget provides an overview of costs. That's your 424A line item budget. On the other hand, the budget narrative is written to give a fuller explanation of why that cost is needed. So the budget narrative of a grant proposal is very important, and it provides transparency for the proposed cost, justification for proposed costs that may appear questionable to PHMSA as the granting agency, and it details how and where the applicant will satisfy cost-sharing requirements, your match, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So, making the 75% pass-through. Applicants are required to provide a detailed explanation of the pass-through of funds to sub-applicants. Here's just an example real quick. Calisota is an HMEP grantee, and they have a planning grant awarded for $120,000. So the state of Calisota has 4 sub-applicants listed in their application, and the sub-applicants and requested funding amounts are Tula County, $28,000, Downs County at $35,000, Falls County, $16,000, and Brownfoot Tribe, $11,000. So the total sub-applicant funds requested is $90,000. That's 75% of the awarded funds. That meets the requirement for the 75% pass-through. The remaining funds, that $30,000 that's left over, or 25% of awarded funds, are used for the grant program administration from the prime recipient grantee. So now we're going to go through the budget object class categories. So this is your line item budget, your 424A, and we're just going to go right down and kind of explain what we're looking for in your budget narrative for each category. So for personnel, of course, that is the employee salaries working directly on the grant project. In your application, please include the number, the type of personnel, the percentage of time dedicated to the project, the hourly wage or salary, and the total cost. Please note this category is limited to only those employed by your organization. Any contractual or consultant costs should not be listed in the personnel line item. Those costs should, of course, be listed in contractual. The fringe category, fringe benefits are allowances and services provided to employees as compensation in addition to the regular salaries and wages. In your budget narrative, please include how the fringe benefit amount is calculated, as well as a description of the specific benefits charged to a project and the benefit percentage. So the theme for fringe, as well as personnel, is why are you requesting that amount and what is that based on? For fringe, it could be organizational policy. Simply cite what the organizational policy for fringe is. If it's based on an indirect cost fringe rate, please include that. If it's based on actual amounts, and that's an estimate, why was that estimate made? Was it based on previous years? Just give the reason. And very important, please note this at the bottom, personnel and fringe costs must be separated into their respective line item categories. Please do not combine these costs together. If we at PHMSA notice that costs appear to be combined, we will need to reach out to you to break those up and get a new budget and clarify each of them individually. So it might be better just to save that step and simply separate them here, please. Travel costs are those requested for field work and travel to professional meetings. In your budget narrative, please provide the purpose, the method of travel, the number of persons traveling, the number of days, and estimated costs for each trip. So if the details of the trip are not known by April 3rd at the time of application submission, please provide the basis for determining the amount requested. Equipment includes those items which are tangible, non-expendable, personal property, having a useful life of more than 1 year, and an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more per unit. In your budget narrative, please include a description, a quantity, and unit price for all equipment. If the expense is under the usual threshold of $5,000 per item, it generally will belong in supplies. There is one exception, and that is if your organization's equipment threshold is below $5,000. If that's the case, please provide an explanation as well as the state policy citation. And so, of course, supplies are tangible property other than equipment, so that is usually under $5,000 per unit. In your budget narrative, please include the type of supply item in general terms. Note, it is not necessary to document office supplies in great detail. For example, we don't need to know the per unit cost of every ream of paper or box of paper clips, etc. One good way to document office supplies is to simply indicate the approximate expenditure of the unit as a whole. However, please note that applicants should include the quantity and unit cost for larger cost items. This would include items such as computers or printers. Contractual line item. So contractual costs are those services carried out by an individual or organization other than the applicant in the form of a procurement relationship. And there are typically two ways to capture cost in the contractual line item category, and those are subgrants and contracts. So what is a subgrant? Well, it's defined at 2 CFR 200-92 and 200-330, as well as there's some other excellent guidance in the super circular that can help you determine whether or not it is indeed a subgrant or a contract. But a subgrant, an easy definition is it's an award provided by a pass-through entity to a subrecipient to carry out part of a federal award received by the pass-through entity. And there's a few criteria for defining a subgrant, but two really stick out and should be thought of. First, does the entity have its performance measured in relation to whether objectives of a federal program are met? And second, and perhaps most importantly, a determination, does the entity receiving funds have responsibility for programmatic decision-making? That is one key component of identifying whether or not someone that you are contracting with is a subgrantee. For example, if a subgrantee, a unit is determining who is receiving training, well, then that is programmatic decision-making and is likely that that is a subgrant and not a contract. So please keep that in mind with your applications as well as your own internal processes, making that determination between a subgrant and a contract. And the funding announcement, when it is posted on February 1st, will have some further guidance on subrecipient regulations that you can keep in mind. So that was a subgrant, but what is a contract? Well, a contract is defined at 2 CFR 200-22 as a legal instrument by which a prime grantee recipient will purchase property or services needed to carry out the project or program under an award. So contracts do not have programmatic decision-making, and they provide goods or services, property or services, kind of in a business-like environment, and it's available to all. Whereas a subgrantee, again, will have that programmatic decision-making element and will be responsible for the award if the conditions of the award are met. Subawards should be listed in the contractual line item category. Now, this may be a departure from previous practice, but please, in your line item budget and in your budget narrative, please list subawards in the contractual line item category. The contractual line item category is more closely aligned with the nature of a subgrant, which is a procurement relationship, and therefore it makes more sense to keep that in contractual line item. Because the other line item are those costs that do not fit in any of the previous categories. Examples may include rent for buildings used to conduct project activities, printing, utilities and or leased equipment, and employee training or tuition. Other direct costs should be itemized and the methodology explained in the budget narrative. For example, we wouldn't want to see, and we would probably request more information if you simply placed other costs at $20,000 without an explanation. Well, we would certainly need to check up on what those costs entail. So please itemize other direct costs. And please note that printing should be in the other line item because it's not a tangible item. It would not fit in supplies. Indirect costs are incurred for common or joint objectives, and they benefit more than one project. In the budget narrative, the applicant must include a current and fully executed agreement if they are claiming indirect costs. please make sure that the rate is applied, the indirect cost rate is applied to the appropriate base in that approved agreement that you submit. If the indirect cost rate will not be approved by the application due date on April 3rd, please attach a letter of renewal or a letter of request that you sent to your cognizant agency to the application. So if you have an indirect cost rate that will not be approved by April 3rd, please include that letter as an attachment and make a statement in the budget narrative under indirect costs stating what the situation is. So overall budget narrative guidance, things to think about as you work on your applications and your budget narratives. Submitting a well-written budget narrative will result in a faster review by PHMSA and hopefully a lower administrative burden to applicants. Please check for computational errors, both in your 424A line item budget and in the budget narrative as well. The budget narrative sometimes is trickier to check for computational errors, so please keep an eye on that. So every number listed in the 424A line item budget should have a corresponding explanation as to how it was calculated in the budget narrative. And likewise, every cost in the line item budget should match the cost in the budget narrative. For example, if you're requesting $20,000 in personnel in the line item budget, the budget narrative should add up to $20,000 and should explain where all that $20,000 is going. The underlying question for budgets and budget narratives that we look at is simply this: why did you write down that number? Just explain why that number was there. Let's briefly talk about match. So matching or cost sharing, of course, is the portion of project costs that are not paid by federal funds. For planning and training grants, this amount is 20% if applicable. And we want to give you some guidance on how to report match. So on the 424A line item budget, enter match in section A and C only. Please do not include the match in section B, where the line item categories are listed. So in your line item categories, personnel, fringe, supplies, equipment, and so on, that should be for federal funds only. Match should only be in section A and C, listed as a total for both your planning and training grants. Again, section B, federal funds only down those line items for each of your grant applications. But where do you report match? Well, match must be fully described in the budget narrative. Within the line item category descriptions, please include a clearly marked section for match. Explain the amount and how it will be met in the same manner you would for a federal share cost item. So for example, if you're meeting match in the personnel line item, in the personnel budget narrative, simply at the end of the personnel section in the budget narrative, just have a match underline and then talk about how you're meeting match. Here's some common mistakes made when writing grant applications, and maybe just some good things to think about as you are going to start working on your applications. One of them are the agency and goals and objectives identified? A lack of clear outputs and outcomes. If there aren't any outputs or outcomes, we will have to request those from you, so please include those in your application. This SF 424A budget, is that substantiated in the narrative? Again, we want to make sure that the costs in the line item budget match up to those in the budget narrative and that they're fully explained. Matching details, a lack of clarification or detailed explanation as to how you're going to make the 20% matching contribution. Please include that in the budget narrative very clearly so that we can identify how the match is being met. Object class category incorrectly used. We touched upon this briefly before, but please put the cost in the appropriate line item. For example, contractual costs, make sure that personnel that may be working under a contract are not under personnel, but they are going to be under contractual. Likewise, keep an eye on separating fringe and personnel costs. CERC and LEPC involvement. A lack of a statement detailing the appropriate CERC and LEPC involvement. Make sure that you address that involvement because it is a statutory requirement. Personnel costs incorrectly charged to the program. If there are undisclosed activities that are being conducted that aren't in the application, well, that may enable unallowable activities. And lastly, indirect costs and missing indirect cost agreement. If you're requesting indirect costs and you don't have an agreement, we're going to need to contact you for that. So it's much easier if you just include that indirect cost agreement or a statement or a letter that you're sending to your cognizant agency for a renewal. And also overlap between indirect and direct costs. Please note, the HMEP Grant Program Office, we request that all applicants of the program discontinue the use of the Calisota Sample Grant application. I believe this was a prior sample grant application. Starting in FY15 and moving forward, please use the funding announcement and the contents of the HMEP grant application development presentation. And a special note about this with the funding announcement, an applicant should be able to simply move in sequential order of the funding announcement to submit their project narrative and budget narrative. If you just follow the steps outlined in the funding announcement, it will result in an overall expedited review on PHMSA's behalf and hopefully a lower administrative burden for the applicant community going forward. And we encourage all states, territories, and federally recognized Native American tribes to apply to the HMEP grant via www.grants.gov. So please apply online. And here's just a slide with our contact information, hmep.grants@dlt.gov, and our phone number, 202-366-1109. That concludes our webinar presentation, and we are now going to open it up to some questions.